Hey, Nick, it's election season and it's also the year 2020. Do you know what that means?
Vacation?
I wish. Well, I mean, every 4 years, I think we all come to accept that people get a little bit more excited and intense when it comes to politics in a presidential election, right? I
Yeah,
think,
I
yeah.
follow more of an agrarian seasonal calendar though than a political, but that's just me.
Okay. But now 2020 because of COVID, these social justice movements, marches, protests, cancel culture, it just it just seems that we're more polarized than ever. But are we more polarized? Is it just 2020 or has this sense of polarization just grown over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so? I mean, me personally, I can tell you that in 2008, just because of the nature of my work and the work I did with my clients in public relations, anytime I posted something related to politics or policy, I would be at times faced with the challenge, but respectfully, respectful challenge. But fast forward to 2012, I began to see people unfriend people on social media. And but is it me, or does it seem like now in 2020 people don't want their kids to marry someone with a different political leaning or ideology? So it's got me thinking, what do people fear? But before we get to talking, we are going to kick it off with our virtual version of Nick on the Street. So let's listen to some sound bites Nick gathered from some folks and their thoughts on the issues they care about and polarization. Let's roll.
What is one issue that you care about more than anything else in this world?
People should know more about the political process in our country.
The issue I'm most interested in is foreign policy. It just always has been. And what we do with our war machine and how we just perpetuate violence around the world. That's my most important thing.
While there's an array of issues that I care about, ranging from the federal debt to police accountability, the issue that I focus mostly on is marijuana policy that I work on full time.
How does the issue of polarization affect that, or affect your ability to make change in that? You know how divided we are, and people get offended, and you can't talk to each other. And
With regards to polarization, I think the solution to it is to get rid of just having a two-party system. If there's a third voice in there, or a fourth or a ninth voice in there, then there's actually room for a lot more nuance in discussions. Whereas with only two, there's no nuance.
so get rid of the two-party systems, and how would you get rid of them?
A lot of different ways we could, but probably the simplest way to do it is to move towards a ranked choice voting system or an approval voting system.
How did we become so polarized?
Media and social media are two huge reasons for that, in my opinion. I think algorithms play a role in it.
Solutions have you heard to this problem?
For social media, I'm a fan of taking a second look at Section 230.
So basically, we need stronger laws to protect people from this new phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, actually, kind of the opposite. We need weaker laws for the social media companies. We need laws that aren't protecting these social media companies and letting them have both ways. They're being able to censor and to act as editors and decide what's okay to say and what's not, but then they're not able to be sued by people for what editorial decisions they make.
Where does cancel culture and trigger culture come into play in this issue for you?
I find myself on the opposite side from some of my liberty-loving friends. I actually don't mind cancel culture. I think it's an natural extension of the right of association, calling people out for bad behavior and allowing others to make their own decisions about whether they choose to associate with them. Of course, people can go too far and it gets into harassment and libel and slander. Of course, that's not acceptable. But that does exist and there's a role for it. I'm a free market, limited government kind of girl. And in order for us to be able to not have over government regulation, we have to have free market approaches to consumer protection. allowing people to know who they're doing business with, what kind of products are out there, what services. Has there been fraud in this space?
How did we get here to the point where we think that people who disagree with us are evil or lazy or stupid rather than just incorrect or
Sure.
different?
So throughout the entire history of this country, it's been a challenge to get people to vote. And one of the things that they figured out can get people to actually go and vote is to convince them that they're fighting evil. That's one of the main ways to motivate people to get out there and actually vote. And hey, if you want to fight evil, you got to vote for me. So that's it. It's the way our system was set up, and it's the way that they have figured out how to make it work the best for them. And when I say them, I mean both old parties. They both use this tactic ad nauseum.
What's at risk here? If for you, what's at risk if we keep getting more and more divided and polarized? Is there anything that you feel that you or we have to lose, or we just become divided and it was just like we were before we were divided, except we disagree?
We have a tendency with this new culture of polarization to dehumanize one another. And I think that's really unfortunate, and it diminishes our own humanity when we dehumanize and demean others. And we've gotten into, like what your previous guest was talking about, creating an enemy and making somebody else look to be evil, when in reality we all grew up here. Many of us did anyway. We have so much common ground. We can overcome that. Stop looking at our people that disagree as enemies and start looking at them as people who have real concerns about their country, about their families, about their communities. I think that we can really start to get to the root of some of these issues.
I'm honestly a little worried that we can see a second civil war. I don't know what it would look like. I don't think we would see people, two armies competing against each other.
This was great, Nick. I love the diversity of views you got from these folks. Was there anything here that surprised you or you'd like to summarize?
Not really. I think what really surprised me is the variety of different answers I got when I asked people, what is the solution to this polarization and how it's impacting us being able to engage in the issues we care about? We heard get rid of the two-party system. We heard just learn more about the political system. We heard there needs to be a law for social media or a relaxed law. I mean, it's all over the place. So I mean, it always surprises me to hear the things that people come up with.
Yeah, I like what's her name?
Heather Fazio.
About cancel culture. So, but this is why we brought on today's guest, who is without question one of the best people to talk about what you can do to be the solution in regards to polarization. His name is Greg Lukianoff. In 2019, Greg and his co-author Jonathan Haidt were awarded with the Hugh Hefner First Amendment Award for their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He is from the Big Apple. He was born in Manhattan in the 70s. He's a Gen Xer like me.
Woohoo!
And and is a graduate of American University and Stanford Law. He is currently the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. In short, it's called FIRE. And he's a big proponent of free speech. And we are so glad to have him on the show today to talk about overcoming our growing polarization in America. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Greg. Let's bring him on screen. Give me a second.
I forgot to snap.
Greg, thanks so much for being here and for the work that you've done for free speech in our country.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let me kick it off by asking you what immediate thoughts or comments you have after hearing what Nick just shared with us.
Well, I think about polarization all the time, and I was worried about polarization back in sort of comparatively halcyon days, that even 15 years ago. But it was partially because I became aware of different mechanisms by which people get more polarized. And one of them is, of course, having an echo chamber and having people around you who agree with you. And a lot of what is actually good about modern society is we have less centralization, in terms of industries, so people can move out to neighborhoods that have people who reflect their values. People saw this coming in the 1970s, and it just sounded absolutely lovely. And then we got this other technology that lets you talk to people who share your values, and that sounds lovely too. And it actually will pat you on the back for, give you a nice warm hug of people who agree with you. But here's the problem with that. That definitely, I saw coming, and several other people did, is that the more you have that, the more radicalized people tend to get in the direction of their position, the more sure they become of it, the more arguments they have, and the more tribal they become about it. So this is why I call this, in my book, 2014 book called Freedom from Speech, I call it a problem of comfort, in the sense that it is, we have this comfortable, nice seeming situation, but it actually has some serious downsides. But in Coddling the American Mind, my book with John Haidt, we referred to as problems of progress, the kind of things that get worse precisely because things are getting better. So my theory is, and it's unfortunately seems to be coming true, is that as some of these otherwise positive developments happen, we're probably going to end up being more polarized, and free speech is going to be increasingly under threat.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. So we're getting better and better and better, and because of that, we're just getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, and you need countervailing cultural trends, not just trends though. You need actual active projects. It can't be something that you can't depolarize passively. Here's the biggest trick to polarization right now. You have to want to talk across lines of difference. And when you look at the polling, as you guys cited earlier, people don't want their kids to date people on the other side of the political fence anymore. And so that's a real problem with depolarizing, is just the fact that first you have to have a group of people who want to talk across lines of difference.
So there was a poll that showed 1 in 3 Americans foresee a civil war coming. Oh, and like 50% of people think that you can't trust the election results that are going to come out of this next election, and they foresee that there's going to be a lot more violence as a result of it. People don't just disagree. I don't think that we just like, oh, you think differently and I think that you are incorrect.
Yeah.
Today, when I have a conversation with somebody and they find out I disagree, they think I'm a bad person.
They think you're evil.
They think I'm evil.
Yeah.
And this is a totally different phenomenon.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call this.
Well, to be clear, and this is a point that I make all the time with Haidt, is that what we're progressing away from is something that is historically very special and very unique. Most of human history is about, what do you do with people who disagree with you? You burn them at the stake. You make them drink hemlock. You crucify them. This is the way historically we deal with dissenters.
The heretics.
Heretics. And the development of, what Jonathan Rauch calls liberal science, and he doesn't mean in the political sense, he means in like the open-minded sense. That was listening to people. Well, first of all, not killing people you disagree with was a big step. Listening to them was a really radical one, and that's part of the scientific method. That's part of what Rauch calls liberal science in his wonderful book, Kindly Inquisitors. That's a discipline. You have to train your tribal brain to be kind of like, you know what? I really, in the grand scheme of things, don't know all that much. I really, really don't. So maybe I should be humble in what I know. Respect people across lines of differences. All this kind of stuff. But that's hard to maintain. And what we revert to, what we're currently reverting to, is a much more natural state for human beings, unfortunately, which is tribal and angry and almost superstitious. When you look at the way that people hold some of these beliefs and just assume people who disagree are evil, when you actually ask them, in some cases, and this isn't true for everybody, of course, but I have noticed that even on political opinions I agree with, when I go on campus and I try to play devil's advocate and see how many arguments people know from the other side, they know almost none, because they haven't actually, they're doing what John Stuart Mill called holding your opinion the same way we hold prejudices. You hold them because you were told to hold them. You really can't explain all that well why, but they're very important to you.
Right. So Jonathan Haidt talks about this. So we have our positions more irrationally. Like we are, like Carl Jung talked about, all of his discoveries came out of these 10 years of doing this like really introspective work. And he just kind of rationally came back over the rest of his career and backed him up really logically, right? But they
Mhm.
came like to him super rational, the dreams and active imaginations. So is this what Jonathan Haidt and you were kind of talking about? Like, we have our opinions. We don't know how we have our opinions. And we
Mhm.
think that we rationally came to them and thought about it through nuanced thinking, but
Mhm.
really not. And we just kind of find statistics that back it up, or is it
Yeah.
a little bit of both, or what do you think?
It's a little bit of both. I'm not saying we're completely irrational. I mean, if we thought people were completely irrational, then there'd be no point to doing what we do, because we are trying to persuade people. But I am definitely willing to say we are usually less rational than we think we are. And I think that's about as
That's a good rule of thumb.
firmly established as anything. And Righteous Mind, Jonathan's book before his book with me, Coddling the American Mind, is a wonderful dive into the different values that liberals and conservatives have, but also putting it on an international scheme. My mother's British, my father's Russian, and they've lived all over the place. And it is interesting to look at how, in some cases, some of the values of American political liberals and the American of conservatives actually, in some cases, better line up with people all over the rest of the world, and it leads to this very stark confrontation of very different worldviews that we like to think we've been brought to entirely through rational argumentation. But really, if you grow up in San Francisco or you grow up in the heartland, like your opinions tend to be an awful lot like the people you grew up with.
And we end up a lot different.
Yeah.
You talked about listening skills earlier, but what is at risk if people cannot listen and talk to each other? I mean, do you think violence is going to occur after this election? Is there a civil war? Because Artie, in this focus group he talked about a civil war. The Social Dilemma, the documentary on Netflix, talked about a civil war. Like,
Yeah.
what do you see? What's at risk?
I'm temperamentally an optimist. I am not, however, rationally an optimist at the moment. I am actually very pessimistic about particularly the next 6 months, because I can think of so many things that could go wrong, and everything historically, we got out of DC for like right before we only had got a kind of spate of violence. It was a curfew that was actually pretty brief, but still it was scary. And we got out of Dodge, and before that, people were saying kind of like, well, what specifically are you afraid of? And I'm like, just a dozen different things sometimes happen when pandemics, things kind of go nuts, kind of reliably. So we're not going to stay in DC for the election. And again, people are like, what specifically do you think is going to go wrong? And I'm like, when I can think of a dozen things, that's too many for a daddy with a 2 and a 4-year-old. So I'll be honest, like I'll be frank, I'm worried. Do I think we're on the edge of civil war? No. I don't. And my good friend David French, who you may know of, wrote a book called Divided We Fall that gives a eerily plausible scenario, 2 different scenarios for the dissolution of the United States. And unfortunately, he's a great arguer, and it's very well done, and it's very persuasive. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet, but I suspect we're going to see some violence in November, one way or another. Do I know specifically from where and by who? Of course not. If I did, I'd just try to stop it. But yeah, in the short term, I'm not particularly optimistic. Now, for a very Russian, and by Russian I mean dark perspective on that, it is important to remember, though, that, for example, when there was when Timothy McVeigh blew up set off that bomb in Oklahoma City, that was definitely a moment where there was a sort of people had moments of clarity on that. It's kind of like, okay, nobody wants this. So sometimes, unfortunately, things have to get really bad before they even have a chance of getting better. I think the country will hold together, but the fact that I have to say it like that for the first time in my life is terrifying.
So I know that people, when we grow up, right, when we're going through adolescence, we grow out of a state of dependency on our parents,
Mhm.
right, who do everything for us, and then eventually we
Hopefully.
do it all for ourselves, hopefully, right? Could humanity follow the same path? Could we actually end up getting to the point of developing freedom as a whole to where now we have to learn to relate to the world in a new way instead of through dependency and control, through something more mature that we don't have
Yeah.
collectively. And I know these are like really heady questions, but
Sure.
could humanity be coming of age here in some way, like a coming of age crisis?
I wish I saw more evidence of that, to be honest. The coddling of the American mind and the whole idea of problems of progress is that um, new problems arise where there shouldn't have been one in the first place. And currently, the thing that for what we're talking about here, the thing that scared me the most for our society was what is called moral dependency. When you look at kind of like the kind of student who goes to some of the fancy colleges, in a lot of cases, they've had intermediated play dates. They've had intermediated free time. They've been scheduled from 9 to midnight or whenever they go to bed since they were little. And then they get to high school and they have people who intermediate conflict for them, that they're actually being told to go and report conflict. And then they get to college and it's intermediated again. So what's happening now is a lot of these students are showing up in corporations, and corporations, their human resources department are completely overwhelmed because they're like, wait, and when they find out what the problem is, it's like, that just sounds like someone made you angry. Like these are things that we usually deal with face to face. Now this may just, what's scary though, in the profound sense, is looking to authority to help you with your problem is not the way you should be taught to think in a free society.
Mhm.
Partially, and you have to really be trained, because the idea of freedom, and people who are libertarians, I think, don't appreciate this enough, this sort of dark truth about humanity. There's something terrifying about freedom. The idea that there could be something out there that could solve your problems for you. I'm as strong of a free speech person as they come, but when you're honest with yourself, you're kind of like, well, that doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world, right? If it's a benevolent force.
Right.
But
There's power in freedom. I mean, we can fly
Listen,
without
this sounds,
wings. We can
yeah,
create worlds in virtual reality with the flick of our finger. We can push a button and blow up the world 10 times over. I mean,
and it's a better way to live. It's a way to be happy, because one of the things that we talk about in the book is the relationship between happiness and freedom. That essentially we're teaching people to deal with small conflicts by giving them to other people, or to make them bigger than they are, and always, and never actually develop that sort of locus of control, that sense of autonomy that you're in charge of your whole life. For mental health purposes and for human flourishing, developing that and actually being able to be like, I can make this decision on my own. Like I can be free. That takes training, and that takes work. And unfortunately, I think we're training a generation of students in the precise opposite of that, where minor conflict is intermediated by someone in authority, and that's training people to live in an unfree society. Training people to live in a free society would look very different.
I sometimes joke and call this first world problems. Uh, I've lived overseas, and I actually lived overseas during the 2016 election, and
Hmm.
I was
Where were
so
you living?
I was living in Japan,
Oh, wow.
and
Okay.
I was super excited that I was far away
Yeah.
during all that, and just see it from a different point of view. Eh, I mean, is this something unique just to the American or the United States culture, or is this happening in other parts of the world?
It is happening in other parts of the world. This is one of the things I do find funny, though. A favorite argument of some of my academic friends is sort of against American exceptionalism, and it's like, even if you don't mean it in a positive way, America's always to some degree different. Like its history is different, its demographics are different, its wealth is different. It's just everything is always at least a little bit different. But when it comes to polarization, the kind of polarization spiral that we're seeing, yeah, this is actually happening. And a lot of the trends that we saw in Coddling the American Mind are happening all throughout the English-speaking world. The book is a weirdly big hit in Spain, which you never know. Like, you suddenly discover, oh wow, look, we're big in Spain for some reason. But apparently this really hit home there as well. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this in the Anglosphere is partially because, well, we speak English, so it's easier for us to get people communicating with us. I do think other cultures have some built-in inoculation to this. And interestingly enough, one of the countries that I think is actually handling the sense of independence better than you would think is actually Germany, partially because of their fascist. There's a great book called Achtung Baby that talks about how after the sort of Nazi experience, you know, there was a generation of students and of parents who really wanted to emphasize focusing on childhood independence. And this book is heartbreaking because it shows how, you know, parents, and I love the fact that it nods the fact that this makes German parents a little uncomfortable to, you know, send their kids off to camp by themselves when they're 6, you know, like for a week here and there. But it's this absolutely conscious idea that these people are supposed to be independent, they're not our possessions, all this kind of stuff. And then she gets back to the U.S. In Silicon Valley, and of course everything's regimented. They have no freedom. It's all appeal to authority in order to do it. And you know, but my quip about this is like, so basically the land of Huckleberry Finn now doesn't understand freedom as well as the land of Otto von Bismarck. But it's been a complete flip, and that's the thing, is you have to value it first. And there are people, believe me, regular people, they want to talk across lines of difference, but there are so many disincentives at the moment.
Hey, let me ask you, Greg, how much do you watch the news? You
You
have a TV at home?
I have a TV at home. I actually love TV. I make no apologies about it.
None needed.
But you know, I'm definitely of the generation Gen X where, you know, someone would sort of humble brag about, I don't even own a TV, and I was always the person being like, you should. TV's great. But yeah, I used to watch CNN. I used to have it on in the background a lot, and it was driving me nuts. So we cut the cord. And now I just, you know, ask Alexa to give me the news,
Highlights.
all during the day. And I probably don't even need that much, to be honest. But the cable news cycle will drive you insane because they're always trying to get you to feel something very strong, and it's not productive.
This is one of the things.
But I'm also, crazily enough, I'm on Twitter all the time, and I actually have a lot of fun on Twitter. Probably maybe too much fun on Twitter, and I don't let Twitter bother me probably as much as it should. And it's kind of funny because, like, in the book Coddling the American Mind, both Haidt and I are very critical of the role of social media for polarization, but also for mental health for young people, and we totally believe this is true. But I wanted to have a paragraph in there saying, but you know, I follow people who wrote books that I respect. I don't bother with trolls. There's all sorts of lessons that you really can learn if you want to about living in a free society from these crazy platforms. One is, you know, ignore the crazies. You know, 2, sometimes there's no point in fighting. You know, find people who disagree with you, see if they can do it civilly. You know, it doesn't have to be as poisonous of a mechanism as it currently is.
Speaking of TV, I missed the 80s when there was no cable networks, and all we had were 30-minute sound bites of the nightly news. Sorry, that's my.
That was about as much as we needed.
That's all we needed.
Yeah.
And I love it. I mean, I have teenagers and one 24-year-old, and they don't watch TV. They stream their stuff, whatever they want. And then they get their little sound bites from like the YouTube news feed or whatever, and that's it. They're done. So I'm hopeful for that generation.
Yeah, I definitely, and the good news is there's a natural human tendency to reject what the previous generation was like. And so that's one of the reasons why you can't, like, any theory that means kind of like, well, if things stay like they are, this will happen. Well, that's a silly theory because things never stay exactly like they are. And my hope is that slightly younger people coming in will think of cancel culture and some of the tribalism as poisonous as it actually is. I've used poisonous twice in the past 10 minutes.
What the heck is going on that wasn't going on for the last, you know, I mean, at least since the last Civil War, that now people are projecting evils and boogeymans and seeing pure evil? Like, there's something going on.
Well, again, I think that's a very seeing other people as simplistic versions of representatives of evil is very common to human societies, and it takes some work to get out of that. Now, one caveat I always give is that I actually do believe human evil exists. I just don't think it's very common. And basically, like, there was a book called The People of the Lie by Scott Peck, M. Scott Peck, who was a popular psychologist in like the 80s and 90s. And he came up with a clinical definition of evil, which is essentially a combination of sociopathic tendencies with a little bit of sadism sprinkled in there. And that's, but thankfully those people aren't that common. So I do believe evil exists in a very scientific sense. But we're applying this to people who at such a low threshold currently, it can't possibly be
Right.
that.
These aren't Hitlers.
Yeah, that six, and that this is a moral intuition that John Haidt and I really share, and one of the reasons why we're friends is, I have a soft spot for pop music based on, just generally having some affection for humanity, that I don't believe your average person is evil. I think that, people are capable of horrible things. But at the same time, I tend to agree with once again, my friend Nicholas Christakis, that there is some real fundamental goodness to it. But for political reasons to a degree, but also from reasons of the fact that we're physically isolated from each other, all these factors that lead to polarization, one becomes very easy to demonize your enemies, and it's politically useful to demonize your enemies. And right now there isn't much in the way of at least sufficient countervailing force to bring us together. It seems like all of the technological developments are pulling on our tribal brains and pulling on our group senses. And once you actually, are far enough away, the person standing in your way is a thing. And this is one of the things that I think is so incredibly messed up about the way higher education is treating a lot of these issues, is that when you look at ways to sort of bridge divides or bring people together or to prevent racial prejudice, for example, the time-honored way is individuation, is understanding this person's individual humanity and seeing them as a person is one of these ways that you can tamp down all of these things. Meanwhile, I feel like campuses, unfortunately, have been really pushing an ideology that involves very much you are a part of your socioeconomic category, your racial category, all this stuff that really screams don't individuate. And
Wait. They're saying that you are a product of like an object
well,
who's moved by external forces, not self-driving.
That due to intersection, well, there's that too, but due to concepts like intersectionality, that you are, the combination of your identities, your, of a particular race, of a particular gender, and that all means something very central to who you are. Now, at its most primitive explanations, intersectionality, sure, yeah, of course, you have intersecting identities, everybody does. But the way it's sort of deployed on campus, it creates this very easy situation to be able to, there was something I remember, like someone was saying on campus was going around was kill all men was something that was going, and then you had all these pundits saying, well, that's not really what they mean, it's really an expression of blah blah blah. And I'm like, no, but it just shouldn't be okay to say stuff like that. Like, yeah. that's not pro human race. Like that's not going to get us anywhere. That's just nasty venting.
So why are we seeing things so political? Like, as if human beings are just homo politicus and don't have other dimensions of life, right? Could this be part of the equation too, in the polarization, that we're just becoming so damn political?
Yeah, the isolation, the technology, the ability to tribalize, to have more arguments on your side, I think this all creates a spiral. And then once you have that kind of moral certainty, it just keeps on pushing things apart, which is one of the reasons why I've become so into different listening campaigns that essentially, sit down, invite someone from a different part of the country, from a totally different experience, have them explain what their life is like, have them explain what they believe and why they believe it, and don't correct them. Just try to find out what the world is actually like. And higher education, and for that matter, K through 12, potentially could be instilling these values. Essentially, like polarization, in my opinion, this hyperpolarization spiral, in my opinion, would be getting worse even without higher education, even without our current systems of education, for all these other reasons. But higher education could be this wonderful mechanism for depolarizing it. But instead, I think it's actually wildly speeding it up from a lot of what it does. But a scholarly attitude about the world, a true scholarly attitude about the world, comes with a great deal of intellectual humility, knowing how little you know about it. And from that perspective, then of course you want free speech because you want to know what people really think. You always want to know what people really think. And those kind of like little aspects of democratic society, these are all habits we're losing because nobody's actually advocating for them, or at least not a sufficient number of people are advocating for them.
The humility.
The
Yep.
humility.
Go ahead, Angelette.
No, well, I was going to say, if you had a magic wand, what solution or answers could you offer to people to be
like let's
solution,
say,
to depolarize?
I got a specific context. So let's say I'm being coddled. Let's say my entire life,
Mm-hmm.
no one's letting me think for myself. They're telling me what I should think and how to think.
Mm-hmm.
And safety is a word that's really thrown around. And now I'm free and I'm in college, let's say, right? And for the first time, I'm exposed to all these different viewpoints. And I feel that they are a threat to my existential, essence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That somebody disagrees with me. What do I do? What's some things I can do to kind of
stop that from happening in the first place?
Yeah.
I'll
not stop it, but
I have a magic wand, a short list. Of course, at first I'd build myself a space elevator, I'd make Mars habitable, and then I would have it be an expectation or requirement for every student in the country, say in their junior year or sophomore year, to do a formal debate. And they have to actually study both sides of the argument and then be ready to argue it either side depending on a coin toss. Ideally, if I could do this perfectly, I would just actually require people to take the opposite point of view from what they actually have. But that's too easy to game. So that's the one I've come to. I definitely think that there should be a gap year between, I think colleges should value people who took that, and that's going to be hard because they're going to come in as more independent thinkers. But I do think that some of this stuff where they are, I think a lot of these students are just in environments that are too controlled, and they need to get out in situations where they can express some autonomy, come in, learn to think for themselves, all this kind of stuff. And that's a lot to fit into a year, so a year might not quite be enough. But I do think that we were surprised to see ourselves advocating a gap year after writing the book, but we became very strong proponents of it because if you go straight from my superpower, like in law school and undergrad for that matter, was I started working when I was 11, and by the time I got to law school, I just had a lot more resources, a lot more maturity that actually made it all feel, frankly, kind of easy. And meanwhile, these kids who had just come all the way up through fancy schools and never actually had a job were really, really struggling, when they got there. So I think that's part of it. You have to do things like have orientation that explain some of these values, that explain some of these ideas, that explain free speech, inquiry. So, I've got three, those are my first three waves, but I could probably do 6 more.
Like a rite of passage. So think about this, right? So we when you're in a traditional or tribal society, from what I've read, I've never been in one, unfortunately. As soon as you can hold a spear, you're given a spear.
Yeah.
And it looks like as soon as you can carry water, you're given a basket, you're carrying water. But in our educational system, I mean, you are just practicing and testing. You're not doing any meaningful work that is impacting anybody's lives until you're like 30. It's like, are we prolonging adolescence? Is something really happening?
100%. We are 100% prolonging adolescence. Normal milestones that kids would hit when they were 15, they're now hitting when they're more like 19. And that's everything from, first serious girlfriend, let's put it that way, to driving, to drinking, like all this kind of stuff. And there's positives of people hitting these later, but they are. And this is, in a sense, sort of also civilizationally normal. Like bar mitzvahs used to be when kids were 13, and that used to be considered kind of like entering adulthood. And it does seem to be getting put farther away. And that's not the worst thing in the world if it wasn't for the fact that the institutions they're entering are ones that we require that we require as a society to help us understand the world as it is. See, and what I'm seeing happening is partially because there's, frankly, a less mature cohort of students coming in than you would have seen maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And less exposed to ideas or words that might offend them. There's an idea that because, 18, 19, 20-year-olds are hurt by the way people talk, that we need to bring the discourse of higher education, the entire apparatus, down to the level of something more like high school. Now, of course, that's devastating to people who are PhDs, people who are doing very serious research. And I puzzle over this one. And I do think that maybe having some kind of, faster way to get your BA, or some other alternatives, because the idea of pulling down all of higher education to be, so it can be amenable to someone who, grew up in a very sheltered situation and comes to school when they're 17, seems like a terrible deal.
Nick, I think I found our next topic of discussion is education.
Mhm.
That could very well be.
I think that
So,
should
so
be.
what is community's role in this?
Look at modern day college orientation. It teaches you all sorts of stuff about like who to report to if you feel like you've been treated in an unwelcome manner, all this kind of stuff, but never actually saying, hey, actually, guys, we expect you to not just tolerate the people you disagree with, but talk to them. Like, this is a scholarly community. It's special. It's weird in a lot of different ways. But here you're supposed to be extraordinarily open-minded and always take seriously the fact that you are wrong on, and the likelihood that you're wrong on this particular thing as well. And this is simply never taught to students. And so you can't throw your hands up in the air and give up on it when we haven't even done the basic stuff. So I actually have this list of 5 things that every alum can do, that can basically ask or demand their alma maters to doing.
Can we hear it?
Sure. Number 1 is get rid of your speech codes. Believe it or not, I'd say about 25% of universities still have ridiculously bad speech codes. I'd say another, 80% of them have, or 70% of them have not great ones. Only a relatively small percentage are totally fine. But it used to be that 75% of them had red ones. They're like really like red light, as in like really super duper bad, laughably unconstitutional stuff. And we've gotten that down to in the 20s. So we've made progress there. Stand up for your students and faculty when they get in trouble. If your students and faculty are getting in trouble for clearly protected speech, the president should be out there early and often saying, I may not agree with it, but it's protected, like these people have rights. Have an orientation is one of the things that I recommend. We actually have a free speech orientation at thefire.org now, and we're working on more developed ways to do that. Poll your students to find out what the environment is like. We actually just did this ourselves because a lot of schools weren't willing to do this, to find out which colleges had more students both on right and left saying you can talk here. Unsurprisingly, University of Chicago placed number 1, Harvard placed in the bottom 10, and actually UT Austin. You're in Austin, right?
I am.
Next to dead last. Out of 55 schools, next to dead last. The other school was DePaul University, was actually with a 55 out of 55. So poll your students so you know if you have a problem or not, and chances are you probably do. And then adopt the Chicago Statement, adopt some kind of updated version of a commitment to freedom of speech, not because that magically does the job all by itself, but because in doing that, you remind people of what these principles are, you find who your allies are. And I've actually recently added a 6th one, which is also look into alternatives. I think that the Yales and the Harvards of the world won't change anything until they actually realize they're going to lose some of those students they want to something that is more innovative, is faster, is more rigorous, that kind of stuff.
Nick, do you have any closing remarks?
There's a difference between wisdom and intelligence. The best definition I've ever heard of intelligence is the ability to manipulate people, things, events in order to achieve a certain outcome. But there's no guarantee that that outcome is going to be healthy, good, productive, or even the outcome that you were trying to get in the first place. That is something else. And that's where I think wisdom comes in. Homo sapiens comes from Latin. Sapiens from sapientia, which means intelligence, discernment, and wisdom. And I think we've got the intelligence part down pretty good. And as we can see from the Yales and the Stanfords and the Harvards of the world. But there's something else that I think is critically essential to where we are today. Because today we have more power and knowledge in our hands, literally in our hands, than we've ever had before. We can fly without wings. We can dive to the depths of the sea without holding our our breath. We can drive or even fly faster than the sound barrier without any changes to our legs. We can communicate across oceans with only a whisper. We can summon any text, video, or audio ever created in the palm of our hands. With the flick of a finger, we can blow up the world 10 times over. We've never had more power and knowledge before. But the question is, where to next? And I don't think that the answer is just more knowledge and power. I think that it's the proper use of it. And that is wisdom. And today, I believe we have been coddling the American mind. And that's why we brought on Greg today. And as a result, the values that traditionally for hundreds of thousands of years have been instilled in our youth through communal recognition, acknowledgement, and imparting of what's necessary to become a contributing, successful member of society who's capable of not just being a part of it, but holding that tension of opposites, right? Without somebody else's opinion being a threat to yours is completely absent. And I'm a big believer in personal responsibility. And I think that it is up to every single person here to usher in this next generation into this world as we bring humanity of age. And that way we can be able to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish and make the change and the difference that most people want to make in this world, and avoid not being able to work with anybody because we can't even talk, or in fact think that they're evil or a boogeyman.
You're awesome. You're awesome, Nick. And I want to thank Greg for joining us today and bringing us some insight today. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Greg. You're the man.
I hope it inspires some of you out there listening to us today. And I want to challenge all of you to do something. What should we challenge people today?
I know exactly what I would challenge them.
I would challenge you to think about one issue or policy you care about and how you can work on establishing common ground with those on the other side of the aisle. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, right? What's your challenge?
Greg, you got any challenges?
Think of it as a duty to seek out smart people with whom you disagree with.
Yep.
That's almost exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, go confront your boogeyman until you're standing face to face with a human being.
Yeah.
No longer a devil.
Oh, that makes such a difference. Yeah, and reading books by people that you think you might hate. I can't tell you how many times I had books that I felt like were they were taboo almost to read them, and then I started reading them, and I was like, this is just an argument.
Yeah.
And you mean not in the sense of like getting the enemy's playbook, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. You mean to understand.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like Thomas Sowell, for example, was someone who, there was definitely a lot of like ideas that he was an evil conservative and you shouldn't read him. And you actually start reading him, and it's like, well, this guy just seems to be really leveling with you in a very straightforward way about his beliefs. You can either prove him or disprove him or figure out if he's wrong or right, but you can't just hide in the idea that he's evil.
Awesome. Yeah. Well,
awesome.
I hope
that's how we end these things, with challenges.
We end it with the challenge, and I hope that everyone shares their challenge, share it with their friends, and use the hashtag #BeTheSolution. Let's criticize by creating, because I know we can all be the solution.